Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. The Logical Christian Podcast is not here to tell you what to think. It's an exercise in how to think. Rather than just accept what we're being told with regard to current events, politics, science, religion, and everything else, we're going to stop the spin, ask questions, dive deep, and look at the world logically. And since logic is a gift from God, most importantly, we're going to look at it all as Christians. Links can be found in the show notes if you'd like to follow along. So with that, let's go be logical Christians. How many times have you said something and had someone look at you somewhat quizzically and ask, "Are you sure about that?" I've been asked that question probably more times than I'd like to admit, and the answer is always yes. I'm absolutely sure about what I've claimed as fact. Now, have I always been right? No. But I've been sure. It's funny, as I've moved from child to adult in conversations with my dad, specifically, that question has moved from him knowing I'm wrong and taking some sort of delight in asking me the question, knowing that I'll find out soon. It's the same pleasure I get when I ask my kid the same question. To now, in conversations with my dad, we talk about deeper topics, more intellectual topics, at least sometimes. And most, not all the time, but most of the time, it's more of a legitimate question, and it makes us both do some more work to figure out if we're right about what we're saying. And he'll still get me from time to time, but shh, don't tell him that. On today's episode, first we need to ruin the planet. Probably, to save the planet. Then we'll come to the realization that the Bible really needed a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer to act as a guide. And finally, you ain't seen nothing yet. So please, if you must exhale, try not to do it into the air. And then try to drive 55. No, wait, that's Sammy Hagar, not Sarah and Hagar. Never mind. And finally, nothing gets the blood pumping like a good old-fashioned argument. Now, having checked and double-checked my sources, doing my best to ensure I have my facts straight, with a high degree of certainty, I am willing to say that I am almost absolutely sure that here we go. Well, I've got good news and bad news. And the part about the good news is a lie. And that's not the bad news. I have other bad news. So, you know how you love the climate, right? And you know how we're literally burning to a crisp, like the bacon I ate this morning. And you further know how science is trying to save us from ourselves through clean energy, the elimination of fossil fuels, the sterilization of men, women, and children, the elimination of people, carbon credits, and carbon capture, right? Right. Well, found on CowboyStateDaily.com headline, Giant Wyoming Carbon Capture Project pulls plug for lack of clean power. I know. This simply can't be happening right now. I already have so much stress. Why do you think I eat and take the smack? And no, that's not entirely true either. In fact, I don't even know if smack is still a thing or if the method of delivery into the body is to take it. But come on. I think we all know stress eating is definitely a thing I'm intimately familiar with. And now this. Have you looked outside lately? Why, one can barely see their hand in front of their face because of the massive quantities of atmospheric CO2. Way worse at night. Can't see anything at night. So what happened? Terrorists, Christians, Indian, Native American burial grounds, the humble buffalo. Was it Trump? No, none of these. They don't have enough electricity available. Well, okay, again, not entirely true. They don't have enough clean electricity, clean energy available to power their direct air capture plant, designed to be one of the largest in the world. The company, Carbon Capture, all one word, said that there was intense competition from data centers for the electricity that's being produced, the clean electricity. In fact, this carbon capture project, tentatively named Project Bison, clever, could require 3 times the output of the natrium nuclear reactor that's being built by TerraPower, LLC, in Kemmerer, Wyoming. Incidentally, this nuclear reactor is being backed by Bill Gates. The reactor output is designed to be 345 megawatts, meaning this carbon capture facility apparently could require 1 gigawatt of electricity. Now, that's a lot of power. That's almost enough power to power, a DeLorean. It's like 95,000 average houses in the United States. And they need this much power in order to capture carbon. As I said, this must be clean energy. Otherwise, they're cleaning a lot of their own emissions, which kind of defeats at least some of their purpose and is sort of kind of hypocritical a little bit. And clean energy options are, mostly they're just terrible, to be totally honest. I mean, there's wind, which is garbage. There's solar, which is more widely used, to be sure, but is actually worse than wind. There's geothermal, which does actually somewhat work, but apparently, that's off limits in Wyoming. And there's nuclear, which is quite literally what we should be doing just everywhere. We should be dotting the entire country with small nuclear reactors, connecting them all in a nice grid, and power the country using nuclear. Using fossil fuels, of course, for things like cars and transportation, cooking, manufacturing, etc., etc. Oh, but of course, as we know, nuclear reactors tend to blow up just all of the time, and then everyone dies, which you'd think the greenies would want, less people, except that it would kill animals and the environment too, and they don't want that. And that literally doesn't ever happen. None of that ever happens. Nuclear power plant issues have been statistically close to zero, and injuries have statistically been less. And in the U.S., zero. I mean, we've had a few emergencies, but absolutely no effect to human life or the environment. That said, we've learned recently how much power fear holds over people, and the fear of nuclear energy is strong. Very strong. Anyway, the amount of electricity needed is one problem, and for some reason the fact that data centers are sucking down just massive quantities of power, that's not a problem for anyone. But the other problem is that carbon collection facilities don't actually produce anything. They're kind of like the government, in fact. They suck. They cost a massive amount of money. They produce nothing, and they want our money for doing it. So the way they make their money in order to function is to sell carbon credits. And for something as large as Project Bison was supposed to be, at least when fully finished, they'd need to sell a lot of carbon credits to major players. The article gives Google or Meta as examples of the massive companies that would need to buy into this. And as a side note, carbon credits are quite simply a kind of roundabout tax imposed by the government through an intermediary like a carbon capture facility paid by companies or individuals to allow them to continue pumping those deadly greenhouse gases into the air all willy-nilly. The entity that's providing the carbon credits for money promises to sequester carbon or plant some trees or something in order to offset the amount of carbon that entity pays them to offset. To summarize this more easily, think of it this way. Carbon credits are a major scam. Anyway, based on the fact that there just wasn't a good clean energy infrastructure for Project Bison, and they weren't drumming up enough commitments to purchase carbon credits, they decided to move on. But never fear, carbon capture, all one word, isn't dead. They just need to find a location that's more stupid idea friendly. I mean business friendly. In fact, they're going to start working on some sort of a facility in Arizona this year. At least that's what they say. Although looking at the old calendar, this year is rapidly becoming next year, so they better get cracking. Sadly for carbon capture, all one word, Wyoming and humanity, Project Bison for now, it's no more. Rest in peace. They planned on removing 12,000 tons of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere annually, then scaling up to about 200,000 tons annually by 2026, and then 5 million tons every single year by 2030. But instead of that, I guess we'll just all burn to death. All because you want to drive your little car around and have air conditioning and cook your food and whatnot. So 12,000 tons, 5 million tons, what does this actually mean? Now, the article cites a current facility constructed by a company named Climeworks and operated in conjunction with CarbFix. I mean, these are clever names. The plant is named Orca, O-R-C-A, which apparently comes from the Icelandic word orca, O-R-K. Ka, which means energy, and I'm curious why they didn't just name it Orca, O-R-K-A. I mean, seems like that would have made better sense, but what do I know? So the Orca, O-R-C-A, plant is a direct air capture plant, like what Project Bison was supposed to be, except it's much smaller, able to capture about 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. Now, this is Climeworks' largest facility as of now, commissioned in September of 2021. They allegedly have a much larger plant in their design book, but a question comes to mind. If upscaling plants like carbon capture, all one word, said that they were going to do with Project Bison, and it's apparently so very simple to do so, why has Climeworks run a relatively small plant for 3 years without scaling it up? Do they not care about the planet? Do they not have the energy needed? Do they not have the customers buying carbon credits? No idea. In order for the Orca, O-R-C-A, plant to do what it do, it uses 8 collection containers, which appear to be about 40 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet, or roughly the dimensions of a semi-truck box trailer, which are split into 6 sections, each with 2 fans on one side, a set of louvers on the other side per section. Inside, there's a filter screen per section. The fans blow air through the filter, which is specially designed to capture CO2, exhausting planet-friendly air, don't think about what plants breathe, out through the louvers on the other side. When the filter is saturated, that section is closed off to the outside world, the filter is heated, and the released CO2 is pumped to the next step. The system is made so that one collection chamber is always being cleaned, while the other 5 are absorbing. The collected and pumped away CO2 is then sent to a mixing plant, where it's mixed with water and pumped deep underground, about 1,000 meters, or 2/3 of a mile. Through natural processes of the CO2-infused water reacting with basalt, over the course of a few years, it transforms into rock. It literally petrifies. Remember, petrification takes millions of years. Unless you do it this way. This rock has white specks in it, which are allegedly the crystallized CO2, and the world can breathe easier as that CO2 will never, ever, ever be released again, theoretically. Why do I feel like that's not going to hold true, or that this isn't doing what they think it's doing, or worse, if the globalists that are pushing this were to get their way? I mean, look, I know there's a lot of cavernous space below the crust of the earth, almost definitely the storehouses of water that broke forth at the time of the global flood of Noah's day, but how much can we pump and petrify underground before we really do something bad? And look, I'm no geologist, but this just seems like a horrible idea, quite akin to, most everything humans have done to try to make things better, all the while making things much, much worse. Anyway, if Project Bison were to be about as efficient as the Orca, O-R-C-A, plant, then to start, the Bison would need 24 trailer units to achieve their initial capture goal. Then they'd need 400 units for the first scale-up and 10,000 units for the full-scale facility. Now, these trailers can be stacked, but let's say they stack them 4 high. Orca, O-R-C-A, has theirs stacked 2 high. That would be about 2 acres of 4 high stacked box trailer-like units if they were all stacked side by side, which they absolutely couldn't be, not to mention all the piping, the pumping systems, the control room or rooms, the mixing facility or facilities, and the water pumping facility or facilities, all to pump this mixture deep into the earth where it will never come back to bite us ever. And can you clean global carbon from one location? Or is this like a room dehumidifier? Like, it will pull gallons of water out of a room in short order while the room is humid, but as the air in the room comes under control, it pulls less and less humidity because, the air simply doesn't contain as much water. Would a full-scale Project Bison-type plant eventually clean the atmosphere in its direct vicinity, causing the system to have to be shut down or partially shut down because there just simply isn't enough CO2 in the atmosphere around the facility for all the systems to capture effectively or efficiently? And this brought up another question. What about the water? We're mixing CO2, theoretically at least, with water and then pumping it underground. Well, water isn't necessarily free, and it's definitely not limitless. And in fact, our hydrologic cycle is a closed system, meaning that All the water that was on the earth at creation is the same amount of water we have today. If we're pumping it underground to petrify, are we, at the very least, removing massive amounts of usable water from a planet that we're already told has massive droughts and lack of water? How long, if ever, before we regain use of that water? And how much are we talking about exactly? Well, an article on spectrum.ieee.org entitled The Water Cost of Carbon Capture from 2010, it said this, quote, "This technology was not developed in a water-constrained environment," says Jared Saferno, technology manager for the Existing Plants program of the National Energy Technology Laboratory, NETL. The bottom line is that carbon capture takes energy, and that translates to additional water use. Now, the article goes on, quote, "Just how much water is pretty shocking. By 2030, the addition of carbon capture technology would boost water consumption in the United States electricity sector by 80%, or about 7,500 megaliters per day, according to research at NETL, which is operated by the U.S. Department of Energy. For a 550 megawatt plant to both capture its carbon and still deliver 550 megawatts of electricity, it would need to add more than 125 megawatts of additional generating capability to cover the energy used in capture. And that's for a power plant. But how much water is needed to pump externally captured CO2 into the ground? Well, according to WRI.org, it sounds like, depending on the technology being used, direct air capture carbon capture requires from 1 to 7 tons of water per ton of CO2 captured. So, pumping 4,000 tons of CO2 into the earth means we'd pump 4,000 to 28,000 tons of water along with it, and at about 36 cubic feet per ton of water, that's 144,000 to just over 1,000,000 cubic feet for the relatively small Orca, ORCA, plant. So that's Project Bison by Carbon Capture, all one word. That's Orca, ORCA, by Climeworks and CarbFix. That's the basic process. But what does it all mean? As in, what does it actually do for us? Well, the 4,000 tons of carbon per year is about the same as 870 cars, according to the EPA. For scale, there are around 1.5 billion cars in the world, and that's a bigger number than 870. So the 4,000 tons, for as big as it sounds, it's fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Back in 2021, Orca, ORCA, was selling carbon credits at the cost of about 1,000 euros, or about $1,100 per ton. Using the numbers I just mentioned, that would mean that for the average car, we'd have to pay about $5,000 per year to offset our carbon spewing in some sort of carbon tax. And make no mistake, unless we turn this country around, and around fast, you and I will be paying carbon offset taxes for our cars, our lawnmowers, gas stoves, water heaters, four-wheelers, chainsaws, and anything and everything else our government deems to be harmful. Not to mention carbon offset taxes for anything made from fossil fuels like plastics of all kinds. For instance, how would you like your new iPhone or your new Android to cost, say, 10% more in order to offset the carbon it took to make it? Yeah, that's fine. You don't mind, do you? Okay, so again, when it comes to carbon capture, what are we talking about? Well, Project Bison, or Orca, ORCA, and other direct air capture facilities are there to simply remove what's already in the atmosphere. The goal would be for all industrial manufacturing facilities, etc., to have their own sequestration facilities in order to treat or remove their own CO2 emissions, but to get rid of the existing excess, the unconstrained additional carbon, like from your car, the stuff that's already in the atmosphere and being spewed into the atmosphere, these direct air capture facilities come into play. So as of right now, we're told that we have 420 parts per million carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. That's pretty small. We're further told that before the Industrial Revolution, that number was more like 300 max parts per million. Now, how do they know? Well, science, of course. And by science, I mean they analyze samples from, I don't know, whatever, and they say that's what it was. In other words, they're likely pulling that number from the land of the imagination. Regardless, that's where they've decided we need to be, the same atmospheric levels, the same global temperature as pre-industrial revolution days. Why? No idea. Probably because fossil fuels are bad and evil, and machines are bad, and technology is bad, and humans are bad, and those making these decisions are power, control, and money hungry, and those following them are blind, dumb sheep. That's probably why. So what would it look like for us to get back to 300 parts per million? Or, let me clarify, our benevolent overlords are not unreasonable. So what would it take to get from 420 to 350 parts per million? Well, according to an article from 1 year ago found on climate.mit.edu, quoting MIT professor of civil and environmental engineering Charles Harvey, quote, "Removing CO2 is one of the hardest and most expensive ways we could address climate change, far more difficult than simply emitting less carbon in the first place. Humanity produces a staggering amount of CO2, more than 35 billion tons of it each year. The Earth soaks up roughly half of that when it moves carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean, plants, soils, and other natural carbon sinks. To fully cancel out our carbon emissions, humanity would have to capture and store the other half, or nearly 20 billion tons each year." So remember, the Orca, ORCA, plant can capture 4,000 tons, so you would need, 5 million Orca, ORCA, plants running at full capacity just 24/7 to simply keep us at 420 parts per million to keep us from adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. Even if you had fully upscaled Project Bison-type facilities at 5 million tons per year, you would need 4,000 of those plants around the globe to keep us where we currently are. Now, if we want to actually lower back to 350 parts per million, we need to get rid of a massive amount of backlogged CO2, 500 billion tons in the atmosphere currently to get us back to 350 parts per million, and 900 billion tons to get us to pre-industrial revolution times. At least that's what they say. So in addition to the 5 million ORCA, ORCA units, you'd need another 125 million units to get to 350 parts per million, or 225 million for pre-industrial revolution levels. Now, if we went with the fully upscaled Project Bison units, in addition to the 4,000 we already have, we need another 100,000 units for 350 parts per million, or 180,000 of these facilities for pre-industrial revolution levels. And then let's say we pulled that 900 billion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and just pumped it all underground, which we wouldn't do that, I know, at least I don't think we would, but go with me on this. Well, we would need 900 billion to 6.3 trillion tons of water to go with it. And if we look at that worst case scenario, that's pumping 226.8 trillion cubic feet, or 1,540 cubic miles of stuff underground. That's to get the backlog. And then we, of course, have to do the year over year stuff that's being produced as well. So, this MIT professor is right. Removing after the fact is really just a stupid idea. My words, not his. As he says, quote, "When your bathtub is overflowing, you don't reach for the gold-plated mop, you just turn off the faucet." Totally agree. But that's working under the assumption that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which I guess I won't dispute, at least in principle. But more importantly, this assumes that an increased level of CO2 is a bad thing, that it will lead to out of control, linear, or exponential global warming, that the CO2 levels in the past were as low and steady state as they're claiming they were without any real data on that, and that the planet shouldn't ever warm beyond the global temperature seen pre-industrial revolution times for some reason, or at least that's what we're being told based on spurious data at best. Now, final spanner in the works here. The latest fear-mongering regarding CO2 is that the oceans are becoming saturated. The oceans are simply incredible things. They literally cause this planet to function the way it does. They balance the Earth. They're the reservoir of the hydrologic cycle. They manage the global temperature by absorbing or releasing heat, doing it very, very slowly, as we wouldn't want massive, rapid temperature changes. And among many other things, they absorb and release CO2. So for a number of years, so-called climate scientists have been watching the CO2 levels rising in the oceans, which leads to disruption of ecosystems, ocean acidification, etc. And if they become saturated, well, the final nail in the coffin would be their inability to absorb any more of our CO2 and just leaving that massive amount hanging in the atmosphere, and then we all die. So I don't have any direct evidence with regard to the CO2 levels measured in the oceans, but current measurements are starting to show that some regions of the Pacific and the North Atlantic are cooling, not warming, which is baffling scientists. But to me it says the oceans are doing what they do. You see, everything created has a natural frequency, a natural vibration. The differences among all things is the intensity or magnitude of the vibration and the period or the length of the vibration. For instance, a wine glass has a fairly rapid low vibration that can be forced out of control by a singer singing the natural frequency of the glass, increasing the intensity until the glass molecules blow apart. The ocean, with regard to the functions it performs on the earth, has a very slow but substantial frequency. So if the oceans are starting to cool, that means that the atmosphere is calling for heat, and the oceans are providing it. The absorption cycle very well may be flipping. Your global temperature measurements and global warming fear-mongering is now invalid. The ocean and atmosphere know much better than any scientist what they should be doing to regulate the planet. But of course, a cooling ocean isn't good either. Big shocker here, because although it could massively reduce global warming, well, it will also bring a, quote, mega drought, or so the fearmongers say. We really need to tell these climate alarmists and so many other talking heads to shut up and go away. I mean, their services are just no longer required. And in fact, one of the other massive carbon sinks for the planet, plant matter, is also growing out of control right now. In other words, the planet is greener than it's ever been because the plant matter, trees, grass, flowers, crops that feed people and animals, weeds, all of it has an abundance of carbon dioxide to breathe. The sun, of course, is plentiful. The temperatures around the globe are stable or very, very slightly warming, which the plants just love. And the hydrologic cycle is functioning as designed. So the planet, the one that's in such danger because of evil humans, is absolutely flourishing right now. As I've said so many times before, God designed this planet perfectly. And even though it's marred and twisted because of our sin, God's design still functions. Now, I'd argue that that's by design from the very beginning as well. If humanity would step back, humble ourselves, admit that we are all inherently knowledgeable, that the planet is designed by an omnipotent creator, we could literally stop overreacting. All we're doing is chasing the data anyway. We can argue the validity of measurements, but we measure, track, analyze, draw conclusions, develop plans, and then we execute or try to get the world governments to force us to execute and comply. But we don't have the big picture. We're making decisions based on evolutionary assumptions, which are completely wrong and unprovable, which means our analysis of the past is faulty. We have, even in a young Earth creation model, almost no planetary data from the past, so we really don't know what happened or what affected what, and we don't know how this planet works. Not really. We have some data, some info, but without a complete picture, we have no way of knowing how the planet, the atmosphere, the temperature, etc., will manage itself, and all we're doing is making things worse. That said, God is still God. He's still omnipotent and sovereign, and he designed this planet to stand until the day that he decides it should fall. We can cause ourselves great pain, we can constantly chase our tails, but God, through his omnipotence and through his design, has created a planet that obeys him, not us. The sooner we understand that, the sooner we can make good decisions for those who live on this marble. Sadly, humanity won't do that until Jesus returns and sets things right. Until then, we do what we can to wake people up one by one, showing them the futility of man, the omnipotence of God, and the grandeur of his creation. Well, here we are again, part 2 of the parts of our look at women in the Bible, as told by a U.S. News and World Report series of articles from 2008. I believe I failed to mention the year in part 1, which matters because this sounds like it was written today, but this was nearly 17 years ago as of the time of this segment. So the parent article, at least as far as we're concerned, is Daughters of Eve, with the byline of, quote, "The women portrayed here all played decisive roles in the biblical narrative." Okay, now from that byline, we should all be thinking, yeah, absolutely they did. The Bible, quite unlike we're told to think, is not a misogynistic, oppressive text. It's a text of different but equal, of complementarianism, or man and woman complementing each other in their uniqueness, not egalitarianism, where men and women are considered to be identical and interchangeable. And although the times of the written biblical accounts are highly patriarchal, they aren't dismissive or demeaning of women. In fact, they're very protective of women as fellow image bearers of God. I've had some people bring up their out-of-context proof texts, ripping Bible verses and fragments out of context to try to argue against that claim. But as we should with all such arguments, when you take it back to the Bible, gently insert it back into the correct context, we find that it's easy to dispute such claims. We'll cover that at a later point. So, as a brief recap of part 1, we looked at their parent article and found that this is a series of articles focused on women in the Bible who subvert and circumvent, defy or dismiss male authority, including God. This is what they feel the problem is with the Bible: men. And this is what they feel is the point of these historical accounts: women fighting back, the feminists stepping up and showing that women are at a minimum equal to men, and in most cases smarter and stronger, with a depth of wisdom and contemplation that rivals even God himself. I'm not exaggerating. This is not hyperbole. This is what these various contributing authors clearly believe. Then we moved into the first article on the first woman, both in creation and in this series of articles. Eve was a risk-taker, not a temptress or victim. Subtitle, quote, "The First Rebel." You can and should go back and listen to part 1 to get the full context. Remember, context is important. That's why I choose to do a probably less popular, long format type of podcast rather than a short, quippy one. Well, that and the fact that I'm kind of long-winded anyway, and I'm well aware of that. Thank you very much. Anyway, the story of Eve, specifically that of Eve eating of the fruit at the prompting of the snake and then giving it to Adam to eat, as told by Naomi Harris Rosenblatt, well, it's slightly different from what you may have read in the Bible, mostly because she mixes up 2 different Hebrew words and definitions for the English word knowledge and adds in a massive number of assumptions about not only the actual timeline, but also Eve's thought processes and decision-making. Ultimately, Ms. Rosenblatt comes to the conclusion that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is really just knowledges of sexual relations and procreation, and that Eve decided she'd rather have kids rather than live for eternity. And although God told them not to eat of the fruit, she actually made the more correct choice, I guess because God didn't really think through the ramifications of his clearly flawed master plan. And we learn that woman is a thinker, a contemplator, a wise sage, if you will, who thoroughly investigates all possible scenarios, choices, and outcomes, while man is a brute, rash, impulsive, unthinking beast. We also learn that God wasn't so much angry with man and woman openly defying his one single rule for them in the garden. No. He was more angry at the fact that they lied to him about it. If they had just come clean, things might have been very different. And then finally we learned that God cast them out of the garden not in anger, but as a loving father who just wants to see his children grow, launch into life, learn and spread their wings. So he tearfully sent them on their way. And he stationed the angels at the entrance so that he, God, wouldn't soften his heart and feel remorse and regret and let them back into the home, which would really stunt their ability to learn and grow. I'm going to need an airsick bag here. Ultimately, utterly, it's just fascinating. I'm trying to say it in a nice way here. Just utterly fascinating. So now with that, let's continue on with this compiled list of strong female characters from the Bible and see what these authors have to say. I know you're sitting on the edge of your pins and needles in anticipation. Found on usnews.com, headline, Why Scholars Just Can't Stop Talking About Sarah and Hagar. Subtitle, Dueling Mothers. Now, I think we can all agree that the scholars just won't shut up about Sarah and Hagar. I mean, enough already. Sheesh. If I've heard those scholars talk about these dueling mothers once, I mean, if I had a nickel for every... So this article is written by one Julia M. Klein, which means nothing to any of us, but I thought I'd get that out there. She quotes Associate Professor of Religious Studies at DePaul University in Chicago and author Naomi Steinberg as saying, quote, on one level, this is the first example of surrogate motherhood, but Hagar, a slave, is never asked to consent to bearing a child, so the narrative raises the timeless issue of upper classes exploiting those with fewer options. Ms. Klein states correctly that Jews consider themselves descendants of Isaac through Sarah or Sarai, and Muslims and Arabs consider themselves to be descendants of Ishmael through Hagar. She also notes that African American women have redeemed and appropriated the historical account as part of a slavery something. It doesn't really matter because she barely mentions it, and no, that's wrong. This has nothing to do with slavery in the West, African or otherwise. We need to be exceptionally careful to not jump timelines and try to drag concepts, definitions, and understandings around with us where they simply don't belong. It's one of the many ways we can corrupt the point of what we're learning. Of course, that's all we've done and do just all of the time right now, but my word of caution is correct, and it really should be adhered to. Anyway, let's back up to Sarai and Hagar, shall we? The actual biblical account is fairly short. You could start in Genesis 15, where Yahweh God cuts a covenant with Abram. As a side note, I maintain that the only covenant that can be successfully made between man and God must be initiated by God. Now, we can promise God anything we want, but as fallible, sinful humans, we're going to fail to keep that covenant at some point to some degree. I personally don't believe we should be making promises to God. Pretty much just let our yes be yes and our no be no, do the best we can, rely on the Holy Spirit, repent for sin, forgive others, etc., etc. There's really no need to bring a promise or an oath or a covenant, at least from our side, into this equation. My opinion. Anyway, this account starts with Yahweh coming to Abram in a vision saying, do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Now, you'd think that for anyone, that would be overwhelmingly wonderful news. Abram, however, was childless and considered any earthly blessings to be kind of meh, because he didn't have an heir. But God told him that he would have a child, an heir of his own seed, and not only that, but those who would come from that promised child would be virtually numberless. Now, moving into Genesis 16, we find that Sarai had a servant woman named Hagar, an Egyptian woman. Sarai made the decision that since she hadn't had any children and was now past childbearing age, that Abram should have a child through Hagar. Although this would be frowned upon, or at least it should be in society today, this was a valid option culturally at the time for Abram to obtain an heir. So Abram did as Sarai suggested. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled about whether or not this was right of him to do. Was he a weak man and just always did what his wife told him to do? Was he not trusting God? Was this cheating on his wife? I don't know. We know that marriage is one man and one woman, and that generally speaking, even back then, multiple wives or concubines or whatever worked out badly pretty much every time. We know that God promised him an heir and that they were trying to shortcut that or, help God out or whatever they were doing. We also know that from a human standpoint, she couldn't have kids, or so they thought, talking about Sarah or Sarai. So at that time, in that culture, in those circumstances, for as faithful as Abram had been and was, well, they were only human. He was only human. Would we have done any differently? Knowing the full story, etc., we can all agree that this was a failure on Abram's part. But knowing decisions I have made and will make in the midst of doing life, well, I'm not going to throw any stones, first or otherwise. That said, we should take from this the very simple yet very deep lesson of trust in God. So, Hagar conceives. It sounds like Hagar flaunted this fact in front of Sarai. Sarai wasn't very happy with Hagar's actions or her attitude or whatever was going on, as this was her servant. Abram, again, could have stepped into this situation, but he told Sarai to just do what she felt was right, which was apparently something bad enough that Hagar fled. The angel of the Lord, quite likely a pre-incarnate Jesus, a Christophany, found Hagar, told her to humble herself under Sarai's hands, and promised that he would greatly multiply your seed so that they will be too many to be counted. He told her that she was going to have a son, that he should be called Ishmael, that he would be a wild donkey of a man, and that he would essentially be at war with everyone. Well, she did as she was told, and at the age of 86, Abram became a father for the first time. Chapter 17 jumps 13 years in the narrative, which brings us to the sign of the covenant between Abram's seed and God, circumcision. Enough said about that. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, changing the meaning from exalted father to father of a multitude, and Sarai's name to Sarah, from princess to noblewoman. He also promised to Abraham that Sarah would bear him a son. Now, Abraham laughed to himself, thinking that, sounded crazy. He was 99, she was 90, and deflected God's promise to Ishmael. But God corrected him that no, a son from Sarah, and his name will be Isaac, meaning he laughs, of course. And that's who the covenant promise will flow through. God also blessed Ishmael through Abraham, that he would be fruitful and multiply him exceedingly, and that he would become the father of 12 princes. He would also become a great nation. And then, through the next few chapters, we have some events that happened over the course of the next year. Then Isaac is born, and again, Hagar was in the wrong, so Sarah sent her away, her and Ishmael. Well, I guess she made Abraham do it this time. God told Abraham to do as Sarah said, that Ishmael will become a great nation because he is the seed of Abraham, but the promise was through Isaac. So Abraham gave Hagar bread and water, handed over Ishmael, and sent them away. Well, they wandered in the wilderness for a while, and when the water was out, she set him under one of the bushes. She went a decent distance away and sat down because she didn't want to watch him die. And I gotta say, he was like 15 years old at this point. I mean, dude should have been stepping up to take care of mom, right? Okay, but again, the angel of God called to her from heaven, reaffirmed that Ishmael would become a great nation, revealed a well of water, and she got the boy, gave him some water, and they went on their way. And God was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and was an archer. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Ishmael comes back to help Isaac bury Abraham. We get the generations of Ishmael later in Genesis. And shocker, he had 12 sons, princes. He lived to be 137 years old. We have his genealogy again in Chronicles, and then that's about it. Now, Isaac, of course, had much more written about him because, through him came Jacob, who was renamed Israel, of whom the Israelites, the Jews, came from. Back to the article in question. The author notes that there is surrogacy. There's an Arab-Israeli conflict. There's oppression of the underclass. All topics that apply to today. That's what we find here. Well, the professor, Ms. Steinberg, whom the author quoted about Hagar being exploited by the upper class through their usage of her without her consent, which I mentioned a few moments ago, seems to neglect the fact that Hagar seemed to take great pride in bearing a child for Abram, to the point of Sarai and then later Sarah wanting to be rid of this person. Not from a point of competition, it doesn't appear, but from a point of attitude and action on Hagar's part. The author says that Jews see themselves as descendants of Isaac, which is correct. Arabs and Muslims view Ishmael as their forefather, which is also correct. And then African Americans use Hagar as a symbol of the slave woman. Why not all Africans or any ethnicity who has slavery as part of their culture's past? Why just African Americans? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. And this is my favorite one, feminists, and nothing good ever starts with that word, feminists see this as a reflection of the male-dominated society of the time. Or they say that the biblical account as written, quote, misrepresents the cooperative relationships that more likely existed among women. Oh, okay. So the account is written wrong, I guess, because that's not what appeared to have happened in this account. Now, the author backs up to Genesis 11, that's where she starts, with Abram and Sarai getting married, starting their journey, which eventually landed them at Egypt. Abram had Sarai say that she was his sister, which was factually correct, but clearly a lie of omission in order to save his bacon. Pharaoh took Sarai as one of his maybe soon-to-be wives, but plagues came upon Pharaoh, who somehow found out that it was because she was Abraham's wife, and Pharaoh sent him and her away. But before the plagues, Pharaoh gave Abram sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels because of her, which Abram was allowed to keep when they were kind of ushered out of the area. I'm assuming the author is assuming that's where Hagar came onto the scene, probably a solid assumption. Now, the author fast forwards to where I picked up the story, Genesis 16, which is the first mention of Hagar, and she fast forwards, although accurately, through a pregnant Hagar being sent away, encountering the angel of the Lord. Then she moves on to Isaac being born. She loses some accuracy when she hits Genesis 21, saying that Sarah was fretting over whether Ishmael would also be an heir with her Isaac. So she sends Hagar and Ishmael away. Well, the account as written does not imply that Sarah was worried about Ishmael being an heir. It said that Hagar, once again, was acting in a way that was disrespectful, and that because of that, the son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son. So said Sarah to Abraham. The author accurately said that they were once again saved by an angel of God. She also correctly states that there is no archaeological evidence of Abraham, Sarah, or Hagar, but since the writing of this article, and really before this article, there was and is plenty of evidence in writings, artifacts that strongly imply these are real people, and that this is a real account. Regardless, she said that the story does, quote, reflect real historical concerns, including the paramount importance of inheritance in Middle Eastern societies of the second millennium BC. Well, Steinberg states that these ancient societies were, quote, patrilineal and, quote, patrilocal, and that they practiced, quote, endogamy. Now, no, I'm talking down to you at this point, but for my own knowledge, I looked up what those probably made-up words meant. Turns out they're not made up, they're actually real. Patrilineal is basically the practice of tracing your genealogy through the male line. Patrilocal is the practice of the woman leaving her family and joining the family of her husband. And endogamy is the practice of marrying within the tribe. Think of Sarai being a half-sister of Abram. So Ms. Steinberg is correct in these classifications, I guess, but then says, quote, that explains why ultimately Isaac, the son of Sarah, was chosen as Abraham's heir rather than Ishmael, the son of Hagar. Not really chosen. Nobody chose Isaac, unless you want to say that God chose Isaac, which would be correct, and I'd argue this choice was made from eternity past, but there was no choice that was made by any human as to who the heir would be. Isaac always was the heir of the covenant promise of God. Now she quotes Alice Bach, an American feminist, there's that word again, Bible scholar, and Archbishop Hallinan, Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Case Western Reserve University. As well as an activist for Palestinian freedom, so you know she's good. The author quotes this individual who correctly states that at the time, having multiple wives, having children through a slave, etc., was completely legal, and then she slides on over into the idea that this story is also a reaffirmation of not only male supremacy, but also supremacy by the divine himself. Quote, One thing women can do that men cannot do is conceive and bear a child, but Sarah's conception of Isaac makes clear that God, who in those days was considered male, was more powerful and could open or close a womb. Oh, so God the divine is or was a male supremacist. That's fun. Probably because he's white. That's my guess. A good thing he's not considered male anymore. Am I right? But I have a concern here with our feminist friend. Where does she get off saying that only women can conceive and bear a child? What a transphobic, hateful bishop. Am I right? And speaking of her archbishopness, no, she's not that either. At least she shouldn't be. I don't think the Roman Catholic Church is an equal opportunity employer with regard to bishops because of, the Bible. But who knows? I don't know. Maybe they are now. Anyway, a professor of rabbinic civilization, etc., Miriam Peskowitz, says that she believes Sarah and Hagar were in fact cooperative in their relationship, not competitive. She believes this story is less about those two and more about the fact that there can only be one favored son, and I'd cautiously agree with her on that little point without having any other context behind her statement. However, the cooperative, not competitive, I don't know that either one of those actually appear to be true, when you read the words. And then we get into the conflict of interpretation with the Muslims. See, they see both Isaac and Ishmael as legitimate heirs, which, let's be honest, is exactly what you'd push as fact if your genealogy is that of the other son. They believe that Ishmael was the son whom Abraham was instructed to sacrifice, and they believe that Abraham and Ishmael rebuilt the holy city of Mecca. Now, apparently, the pilgrimage, or Hajj, is a celebration of Hagar and Ishmael. From what I found, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, apparently they agree with the biblical account that Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, and they ran out of food and water. But then their account, well, it diverts slightly, saying that Ishmael began crying for lack of water. So Hagar ran back and forth, I'm not sure between where, 7 times, and upon returning to her son, found a well of water had simply sprung up under his feet. Look out. The pilgrimage is apparently the route, or at least the distance, maybe, that Hagar ran looking for water. So no angel of the Lord here, no promise of being made a great nation, and apparently Hagar and Ishmael returned to live with Abraham because about 18 years or so later, Ishmael was apparently the son brought up the mountain to be sacrificed, but was ultimately saved by a lamb or a ram. Isaac would be about 18 to 20 years old at that point, making Ishmael around 30 when he was bound to the altar. I don't want to dig too far into this, but when looking at the Bible versus the Quran with regard to textual criticism, or how verifiable or verified the text is, the Quran, despite claims made by the Muslims, can't hold a candle to the Bible. See, the Quran, or Quran, however you want to say it, wasn't a thing until Muhammad had it told to him by what was likely a demonic presence, or I would say probably Satan himself, in the 7th century. Muhammad himself was illiterate, so he couldn't read or write any of this, so he told people what he had been told, and some people scrawled down some notes on stone or papyrus, even on bone, but for about 100 to 150 years, well after the death of Muhammad, the Quran was simply transmitted by word of mouth. Eventually, it was ordered to be written down, but with regard to manuscript evidence, the fact is that we really have no idea what Muhammad was told or by who, or if anyone or anything, to be honest. There just isn't much of anything to back up the Quran. As for the Bible, although Islam claims the Old and New Testament were uncontrolled, having been written by many authors, not just one, which is the selling point they stand on to claim the Quran is uncorrupted. That alone doesn't prove anything, just FYI. The Bible has a variety of versions of manuscripts, which did lead to some different translations based on the manuscript of choice, but now there's a plethora of manuscript evidence. And the errant anomalies have been easily identified and eliminated, at least from most translations. The Bible is right now, and will always be, the most verified piece of literature in the history of the entire world. The Old Testament, not as verified as accurate as easily as the New Testament with regard to manuscript evidence, although with the practically miraculous agreement among the Masoretic text, the Septuagint or Greek translation of the Hebrew text, and finally the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is agreed confidence that the Old Testament, as written today, is correct with regard to the original text and oral transmissions of the account. As for the New Testament, there are thousands upon thousands of transcripts, from small fragments to large portions of text with major, for all intents and purposes, universal agreement. In fact, there's so much textual evidence that outliers, think errors and fabrications, they're easily culled, and the text we have today in the New Testament is the most verified written text in all of history. In fact, it's more verified than even Shakespeare's works, which were written after the advent of printing, which have manuscript gaps that have had to be creatively filled in order to have complete plays. I don't know about you, but I've never heard that before. And keep in mind that the Old Testament is quoted nearly 1,000 times in the New Testament, so the verification of the New kinda also sorta leads to the verification of the Old. Back to our point. Islam can claim whatever they want, but they have absolutely no leg to stand on with regard to how they want to believe Ishmael plays into biblical history. Ishmael is a son of Abraham, blessed by God to be the father of a great nation, but he is not the child promised through the covenant sworn by God to Abraham. He was not the child nearly sacrificed by Abraham. He is not the heir or a co-heir as they like to claim. And from a biblical standpoint, the significance of Ishmael is that he, and really his descendants, would be a wild donkey of a man, a fighting, warring outcast of a nation, living in the face of its brothers type of man. But not with him. Moving on through the end of the article, Ms. Klein quotes author Dolores Williams saying that Hagar is, quote, an analog for African American women's experience from slavery to the problems of single mothers today. However, Ms. Williams sees Hagar as a survivor. Quote, we say God has made a way out of no way. Apparently, with regard to, quote, Hagar's miraculous rescue in the desert, or so says our article's author. Now, I could have sworn that the phrase makes a way where there is no way or something along those lines is taken out of the scriptures somewhere, but honestly, I couldn't find it exactly or even really that closely, but it's possible that it's co-opted by the charismatic crowd from Isaiah 43, which says, thus says Yahweh, who makes a way through the sea and a path through the mighty waters, who brings forth the chariot and the horse, the military force and the mighty man. They will lie down together and not rise again. They have been extinguished and quenched like a wick. Do not remember the former things, nor carefully consider things of the past. Behold, I will do something new. Now it will spring forth. Will you not know it? I will even make a roadway in the wilderness, rivers in the wasteland, and it goes on. Now, I know the phrase, do a new thing or do something new, which you heard in that passage just a second ago, is one of the charismatics' favorite prophetic buzzwords, so maybe that's where all of this comes from. I don't know. Not a shock that she would pull scripture out of context to make a point, to be totally honest. That's a favorite trick of, pretty much humanity in general at this point. Now, especially since she's deemed Hagar a survivor, she needs this to be pulled out of context. I mean, literally, we know nothing about Hagar. Hagar is mentioned in 10 verses total. The bulk of those are in Genesis 16, with Hagar conceiving and giving birth to Ishmael. And then she's in Genesis 21 a few times, being sent away by Abraham. And then she's mentioned one time in Genesis 25 as the Egyptian mother, Sarah's handmaid, mother of Ishmael, at the start of his genealogy. And that's literally all we hear of her. She's mentioned nowhere else in the Bible, but Ms. Williams had a very specific theology to develop and to push, so she needed this to be true. So, Ms. Williams, an American Presbyterian theologian and author who interestingly passed away on November 17th, 2022, the same day as her birth, 88 years earlier, was key in the development of what's termed womanist theology. Now, again, I don't want to speak down to any of you. Just pretend you don't know what womanist theology is, which, by the way, just sounds like it's probably so very good. Womanist theology, per Wikipedia, quote, is a methodological approach to theology which centers the experience and perspectives of black women, particularly African American women, within Christian theological discourse. Womanist theology emerged as a corrective to early feminist theology written by white feminists that did not address the impact of race on women's lives or take into account the realities faced by black women within the United States. Similarly, womanist theologians highlighted the ways in which black theology, written predominantly by male theologians, failed to consider the perspectives and insights of black women. Basically, this is a feminist offshoot of black liberation theology, which is a woke, racist, generally heretical and blasphemous theology of some sort, based more in the hatred for anyone not black, especially not so-called African Americans, than it is in the Bible. As so many Christian-based heretical cults do, this really just uses the Bible as a launching pad to push their own agenda, or quasi-religion, for terms of power and control or money or whatever they're shooting for. So we have no idea if Hagar was a survivor. I mean, from all indications, it appears that Hagar was kind of a jerk, not able to control herself, which got her in trouble, and then was willing to just lay down and die and let her teenage son die, but she left him alone to do that. She didn't want to be around for that. Now, she may have been a wonderful woman. We have no idea what any of the rest of her life was like, but what we do know is that from those, 10 verses, that there's literally no parallel to the African American woman's plight, slavery, single motherhood, or anything else. And finally, coming to Christians, we also appear to co-opt this story for our own use, is what we're being told, or at least that sneaky shyster, the Apostle Paul himself, did that for us. See, in Galatians 4, as she points out, quoting Elizabeth Castelli, associate professor of religion at Barnard College, who selectively quotes parts of Paul's writings, says this, quote, Paul attempts to convert it into an allegory about the triumph of Christianity. He says that Hagar's son was born according to the flesh, while Sarah's was through the promise. In a passage that remains controversial, he says it is Christians, not Jews, who are the sons of the free woman. By claiming that followers of Christ are the true inheritors of Abraham's covenant with God, Paul is performing an extraordinary contortionist move that inverts the Jewish interpretation of his time. So yeah, bottom line, yes, Paul does this. That he says that Christians, Christ followers, are the true inheritors of the promise through Jesus, through the Jews, through Abraham and Isaac, and that Christians, all those who are born again, Jews and Gentiles, who are saved by God's grace through faith, are part of that promised seed. Ishmael is correctly labeled as born according to the flesh because Abraham and Sarah took God's promise into their own hands and decided that God needed a little help, which clearly he did not. So the Jews would have no problem with saying that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were their true fathers, those who were given the covenant promise of God, not Ishmael. Paul saying that wouldn't be shocking to the Jews. They would understand that. They would agree with that. What would be shocking is the inclusion of the Gentiles because, ew. And that would be totally understandable at that time. But for a professor of religion to say that Paul attempts to convert it into an allegory about the triumph of Christianity, no, he didn't do that. He, or more accurately, the Holy Spirit through Paul, was simply revealing the truth. Now, see, the New Testament is concealed in the Old, and the Old Testament is revealed in the New. Paul was doing nothing but clarifying to the Christians at Galatia how they fit into the covenant that God made with his elect. And if you're saved, regardless of sex, color, nationality, background, age, Jew or Gentile, if you're saved, you are God's elect, bought by the blood of Jesus, a sinless Jew whose blood was shed for all those his Father has given him. The author wraps up her contribution to this overall conglomeration of articles with, quote, The complexities of the Sarah and Hagar story continue to make it fertile ground for theological debate. That may be because at their core, these biblical passages address the question, what does it mean to be a member of society? Who's in and who's out? Says Steinberg. They're answering identity questions from long ago and into the present. And no, if that's what you get out of the story, you clearly have no biblical understanding, probably shouldn't be talking about it, and are blaspheming the name of God by trying to make his word say what it absolutely does not say. But again, this is the world, right? This is the unsaved world trying their best to interpret something in the Bible in a way that makes it more of a TED Talk or a life lesson, rather than what it really is, a historical account that points directly to Jesus as our one and only way to be saved, and God the Father as omnipotent and sovereign God. It feels much better for the unsaved, and it's a much easier sell to the unsaved masses if you just ignore what this really is and just turn it into a societal lesson, one of racial division, or a lesson about discrimination and inclusivity. Those are the things people want to hear about today. And if the Jews can be demonized as hateful, bigoted people as well, Abraham using his slave for his own devices with absolutely no regard for her feelings, well, all the better, right? Okay, so I said we get into the next account, one about Zipporah, so we'll have to pick up the pace a bit. No. I'm not going to do that to you. This has gone on far too long already. Zipporah, the woman who stood up to God, will have to wait, and maybe we'll be able to get to Bathsheba, wife, mother, queen, object of royal lust. Maybe we'll get to them next time, and we'll see what the unsaved, agenda-driven, progressive woke minds have to say about those accounts. But for now, look, go read your Bible. Read it for what it says. Don't listen to the spin doctors. Don't try to make it say what it doesn't say in order to scratch an itch that you seem to have. Don't worry about the inclusivity and the patriarchy. Just read God's word as given. It's literally sufficient all by itself when read in its proper context. Well, have you been Bereaning over the last month or so? Have you been testing what you're hearing, studying your Bible, striving to understand what you believe and why? I knew you were. So, this is Let's Be Berean, Chapter 8, a look at some notes I've been taking on my mostly daily Bible reading, my thoughts, my questions, my revelations. Oh, speaking of, cue the foreigner.
Warning, Governor. The following commentary are the thoughts, questions, and revelations, but not in a charismatic sense, of the host of the Logical Christian podcast. Although the host a wise, revered, although not infallible sage-like individual attempts to do his due diligence in validating these thoughts, questions, and revelations, but not in a charismatic sense. Before bringing them to you, the faithful listener, it is possible, although highly implausible, that he may be, although only the slightest bit in error. Please ensure you do your own research. We must all be Bereans. Should errors or questions arise, please contact the jovial, witty, and impeccably humble host with any and all comments. And just for the record, he totally didn't make me say any of this. No, really, these are my own personal observed. No, I just can't do it. All right, Topper, let's be Bereans.
All right, no reason to beat around the bush. I don't have a bush in my immediate vicinity. I don't have my bush-beaten stick, and it would make no sense anyway, especially with the topic at hand having nothing to do with bushes, shrubberies, or any other topiary-themed vegetation. Okay, so when we last met, we had just entered the land of Deuteronomy. This is the last of the Pentateuch, the final book of the era of Moses. Moses is largely recounting who God is, why they're wandering in the wilderness, why God rescued them, who they are, and the laws, the celebrations, the ordinances, etc., to be followed and observed in their worship of their God. And we left off with Moses telling the Israelites that he would not be leading them into the promised land, that honor would fall to Joshua. And besides Joshua, the only other person who was over 18 at the time of God's punishment of 40 years of wandering due to their lack of faithfully trusting God to go into the promised land was Caleb. The rest of the inheritors of the promised land would be those who were less than 18 years old at the time of the punishment, meaning that besides Joshua and Caleb, the oldest man moving into the promised land would be 57 years old. The Israelite clan was a relatively young nation at this point. As Moses was recounting the wandering, he mentioned that Mount Seir was given by God to Esau, so don't provoke them as you pass through and pay for anything you eat or drink. And fast forwarding a bit, we're now at the current day. All those who were to die prior to crossing into the promised land had died. It was nearly time to move in. God told Moses to tell the people that they were going to cross the border of Moab, but Moab was given to the sons of Lot, so leave them be. This land was regarded as the land of the Rephaim, a people as great in number and as tall as the Anakim. But God wiped them out and gave the land to the Ammonites. I tell you this for two reasons. One, giants were real. I mean, not like Jack and the Beanstalk giants, but people who were clearly huge as compared to average humans. And two, it says that the Ammonites didn't call them the Rephaim, they called them the Zamzumim. And that's just kind of a fun word to say, Zamzumim. That name apparently means plotters, so maybe they were a clever, shifty people? I don't know. Moving forward into verse 24 of chapter 2, God told the Israelites that they would set out through the valley of Arnon, where he had given Sihon the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, and all of his land into their hands. This is where he would put the fear of the Israelites into the hearts of all the land. So Moses sent a message to Sihon saying he would pass through, they would touch nothing, they would buy food and water from them, they just wanted passage through the land. But verse 30 says, quote, "But Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land, for Yahweh your God stiffened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to give him over into your hand as he is today." Now, there's an argument regarding Pharaoh as to who hardened his heart. The reason being because half of the plagues say Pharaoh hardened his heart, the other half say God hardened it, approximately. So which is it? This usually comes about because of an argument of Calvinism and Arminianism, God's sovereign election versus man's free will. Now, stepping back to the story of the plagues, I actually recently had this discussion with some family members, you know who you are, and we talked about who hardened Pharaoh's heart. So it's true that the first signs given, the staff to a snake, the water to blood, the Bible says that Pharaoh hardened his heart, which sounds like a free will argument. But that's discounting the verses right before Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, right prior to those first signs where God says, quote, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart with stiffness, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt." Okay, this absolutely speaks of God doing the hardening, his sovereignty controlling the world. But Pharaoh had already denied the Israelites the leave to go into the wilderness to worship their God. That was a few chapters earlier in Exodus. And although it doesn't say that Pharaoh hardened his heart, it clearly shows that Pharaoh made that decision prior to God saying he would harden his heart. Except that discounts a chapter earlier than that when God told Moses that when he goes to speak to Pharaoh, quote, "As for me, I will harden his heart with strength so that he will not let the people go." So that sure seems to me like God was the sovereign one. And as the Old Testament is revealed in the New, don't forget that in Romans 9, Paul, and remember the entire Bible is God-breathed, Paul said, quote, speaking of God, "For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it does not depend on the one who wills or the one who runs, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, in order to demonstrate my power in you, and in order that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires." Now, unless you want to argue with Paul, this seems clear that God is sovereign. Free will, yes, does exist, but it's not absent of God's ultimate sovereign will. In other words, Pharaoh was born, he grew, he lived, he took over as ruler of Egypt, but he ultimately had only one purpose. God had one purpose for him, and that was for him to demonstrate his power. That was it. People don't like that. It doesn't feel good to say that, but that's what the text says. So coming back to Deuteronomy 2, we see the same thing with King Sihon. Moses, recounting the event, said, quote, "But Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land, for Yahweh your God stiffened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to give him over into your hand as he is today. And Yahweh said to me, see, I have begun to give Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to possess so that you may fully possess his land." God is sovereign. He's not, and I hate this analogy, he's not a master chess player countering the moves made by Satan or by man. He's not waiting to see what your next move will be so he can run through all the possible new scenarios and choose the best one so that all things work out for good. He's already set up all the moves for both sides of the board for our maximum good and, more importantly, for his maximum glory. Now, that doesn't absolve us of our actions, as we freely act based on the inclination of our hearts. And how all that works together, I have no idea. But I also don't understand how the Trinity works exactly, and I'm more than happy to accept that as a fact. So, moving on, now that I've irritated a number of people, we get a very short bit of info on Og, the last of the Rephaim. We find out that his bed was 9 cubits by 4 cubits. That's about 13.5 feet long, about 6 feet wide. To give you some scale on how big that is, you could place 2 king-size beds end to end on his bed. Now, maybe he just really liked a big bed, or maybe he made huge tents over his bed and played fort. I don't know. Maybe he was a giant of a man, right? The average size of a man today is, 5'10"? A king-size bed is about 6'8". That's about 14% longer than the average man's height. I know, I'm bringing math into things. If we were to back calculate that, that would make Og about 11 feet 10 inches tall. Now, is that what he was? Probably not. But I wouldn't be shocked if he was at least 10 feet tall, maybe taller. However, if you look at it, Og was apparently a big guy. And with a name like Og, well, he'd kind of have to be a big guy, wouldn't he? Coming to the end of chapter 3, we find Moses recounting his one last plea to God to be able to cross into the promised land. This was after they conquered some land on this side of the Jordan, after Moses made Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh swear to fight for the promised land like their brothers before they went back over the Jordan and occupied that land. The Bible says, quote, I also pleaded with Yahweh at that time, saying, O Lord Yahweh, you have begun to show your slave your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Let me, I pray, cross over and see the good land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. But Yahweh was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. And Yahweh said to me, Enough! Speak to me no more of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes to the west and north and south and east and see it with your eyes, for you shall not cross over this Jordan. Now, you want to feel for Moses, right? I mean, from our standpoint, what Moses did, hitting the rock rather than speaking to it, it's kind of a big nothing, right? I mean, I wish that was my worst offense against God. But if you recall, when I read that account in Numbers 20, I don't know, however many months back, yes, Moses and Aaron were to speak to the rock, and yes, Moses struck the rock twice with his rod. But it sounds to me that more than striking the rock, it had to do with Moses saying, quote, Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? And then he struck it. Moses, and he grouped Aaron in there with him, gave himself the credit for the water. Shall we bring forth water? Whack, whack. Right? So God, when he told Moses his punishment, said, quote, Because you did not believe me to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. I wonder if Moses, if he had struck the rock, but in his words gave Yahweh the glory for the water, if his punishment would have been different. But beyond that, look at what Moses said in his final plea. Quote, You have begun to show your slave your greatness and your strong hand. Begun, right? Moses was spoken to by a burning bush. He saw miracle after miracle, plague after plague. He followed a pillar of cloud and fire leading the Israelites. He passed through not one, but 2 bodies of water on dry land, with the water piled up beside him. He saw battles won by raising his staff. He ate manna for 40 years. He saw so many birds brought for meat that it was coming out of their noses. He saw the ground open up and swallow Korah and his followers and then close up again. He saw a plague stopped with a bronze serpent on a pole. He saw the Israelites wear their clothes and their shoes for 40 years didn't wear out. He stayed on a mountain with God for 40 days with no food or water. as he was given the laws, including the tablets that he apparently saw the finger of God write on, giving us the 10 Commandments. He was literally covered by the hand of God and then allowed to see his back parts as he passed by. And yet he says, "You have begun to show your slave your greatness and your strong hand." Moses had some understanding of the limitless might and power of Yahweh God. And with all that, Moses is looking at us saying, "You ain't seen nothing yet." And with the rest of the Bible, with the miracles or things like that we like to call miracles in our lives, with the biggest miracle of all being saved from death and hell for eternity through the sacrifice, the blood, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, with everything we know and think we know, and I'm not discounting that at all as being the greatest thing of all, I think Moses would still look us in the eyes, having been in paradise for thousands of years now. He would look at us and say, "Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet." And that's probably a good place for us to stop. Thinking about the absolute omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, the sovereignty of God, in short, the unlimited nature of our God. We ain't seen nothing yet. Maybe that gives us a little bit to ponder as we dig into the scriptures. Okay, as always, let me know what you think. Give me feedback, ask questions, tell me what you're learning. But whatever you do, get up, get off your duff, go be a Berean. And with that, sadly, we've reached the end of yet another episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I feel we've bonded as we've laughed and cried and twisted our faces in incredulity. If you've enjoyed or found value in what you've heard, go on and do all the podcast things. And don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Lawrence J. Peter said, "Against logic there is no armor like ignorance." Jesus told us that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.